For our Veriton viewers and listeners, it's Maynard, Mike, and Arjun here with something we're super excited about. Philippe Ducom is joining us. He's the president of ExxonMobil Europe. We got to know Philippe because he started speaking out in public in various venues and in various writings, talking about European competitiveness, talking about what he saw as the threats to a lot of things that Europe hopes to accomplish, and also just the phrasing for European governments, sort of a different way to think about where we are, which is the competitiveness of Europe relative to the rest of the world and the importance of getting a number of key policies right. So, Philippe, let me welcome you to COBT. We're delighted to spend some time with you. And let me just say thank you so much for speaking out. That's how we found you. And we're excited to talk about your thoughts.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Really appreciate being with you today.
Well, it's going to be great. I should have mentioned Philippe has been with ExxonMobil for 37 years in a number of countries in different capacities. So his background in energy and chemicals and everything that Exxon does, we got a lot to talk about this morning, Mike. Speaking of a lot to talk about, the market, wow. What would you tell us to get started with Philippe?
Hey, Maynard. It's great to be back from Panama. I was there for about 10 days, and in those 10 days, markets look great. And I get back, and then we get this deep-seek news, and everything falls apart. So it's been a lot of volatility, and I expect there's going to be a lot of volatility going forward. So let's first talk about bond market. A bond, 10-year bond yields around 4.55% right now. They've come down a little bit, and I think the key is the markets are looking at Wednesday's, which is tomorrow's FOMC rate decision. Most expect that there's going to be no cut in rates, even though Trump's going to be pressuring them to cut rates. And so there's probably going to be a little fallout from that. I'd say the more important factor is, what does Powell say? What are his remarks tomorrow about future interest rate policies? That's going to be a big key. And I think the March meeting is going to be even more important because I think most people expect there's going to be a rate cut there. So keep that in mind. I'd say from a broader equity market standpoint, the S&P was down about 2% yesterday on a 5% pullback in technology stocks. Today, the S&P is up around 1% on a 3% gain in technology. So you see there's a lot of volatility there. NVIDIA's stock price was down roughly $590 billion in market cap just yesterday. That's the biggest one-day loss in history. All this volatility was due to news on this company, DeepSeek, which is a Chinese AI startup company with a new and cheaper open source AI model. Now, so the question is, why is all this volatility? And I think the reason is because DeepSeek's open source AI model can be done at a fraction of the cost. It means it's going to be cheaper. You're going to need, you need cheaper chips. It's going to be more efficient. You're going to need less energy, which is challenging the current premise that big tech needs to be spending massive amount of capital on this, as well as massive amount of capital on data centers. So that's really, challenging that conventional wisdom. We'll get back to and talk about, some of the implications on the energy side in just one second. But from a crude oil standpoint, crude oil is down about $1 over the last couple of days, and it's down from about $80 just 2 weeks ago. I'd say the big thing that crude oil market observers are watching is the JMMC meeting next Monday. Expectations is that they're going to basically leave oil production, oil supply unchanged, despite Trump's insistence that they basically increase supply and lower prices. And so if they do bend the knee, that's going to be a big surprise for market. We don't expect that to happen, so it's something to be on the watch out for on Monday. As far as natural gas is down about 50 cents an M this week alone. We're around 350 an M. And so most of that is just because the weather forecast turned a little bit warmer. But I think a little bit of that is because people are, basically considering what natural gas demand is going to look like with a lot of this stuff we're talking about on the electricity demand with some of this DeepSeek news. Now, finally, on the energy equity side, some of these energy equities, some of these electric equities have really been deeply pounded this week. And it's because, most people think, with this DeepSeek model that we're going to need less energy, and it's going to be less climate impact. And so that means electricity demand is going to be much lower than projected. And I think, that might very well be the case, but I do think electricity demand and gas demand over the next 5 or 6 years, it's still going to be historically fantastic. It just may not be as good as people thought it was going to be a week ago. And so I think the market's kind of dealing with that right now. When we think about, some of the stocks that really got pounded here in the last day or two, it was IPPs. These stocks in general are down about 20%. We're talking about Constellation Energy, Vistra, NRG, and Talon Energy. Some of these distributed generation companies were down anywhere from 10 to 30% this week. Natural gas E&Ps, they got hit obviously because of warmer weather, gas prices coming down. And the other names that really got hit this week were just natural gas midstream companies on this thesis that, natural gas demand over the next 5 years is going to be really, really good. Companies like Kinder Morgan, like Williams Energy were down about 9 to 10% on some of this deep seek news. So it's something to keep an eye on. The last thing we'd say is that this Thursday and Friday, you're going to have two refiners, Valero and Phillips 66. Phillips 66 are going to be reporting their Q4 results. And oil majors, that being Chevron, Shell, and ExxonMobil, are going to be reporting their Q4 results. So I would expect these companies are going to be talking about 2025 CapEx. They're going to be talking about electricity demand. They're going to be talking about data center partnerships. We just saw Chevron, have it, come together with a data center partnership just this week. And so we're going to hear about OPEC policy, and we're also going to hear about Trump's executive orders. And so I think these calls are going to be ripe for a lot of Q&A on all those subjects. So, it's going to be a very interesting week for energy. It really starts to kick in over the next 2 weeks for traditional energy. So we're looking forward to that. And so, Maynard, we're going to hand it back to you. We look forward to really talking to Philippe about some of these issues in Europe right now. And so it should be a really interesting conversation.
Okay, great. Arjun, before we jump in with Philippe, what would you add?
Maynard, as sort of Mike was alluding to, it's been really a dramatic week that we've just had. Now, whether it's COBT, Veridin, or Super Spiked, we're not here to try and do hot takes. We are trying to focus on what is the long-term macro strategy, maybe even policy outlook. But we've had an incredible week one of Trump being inaugurated and all of his actions, Davos, and now DeepSeek. And if you go through those, in reading a lot of the commentary for the folks that regularly attend Davos, and I'm going to focus on some of the energy folks, there did seem to be some sort of mourning, if you will, that sort of Davos is the center of the world, and here's all the policy we're going to come. There was a sort of a resignation that the world was a little bit passing them by from my take on some of these, the takeaways from folks that who regularly attend. And that sort of mindset that climate is all that matters and sustainability and ESG is the number one objective. These are important considerations, but as you know, we've pushed back on that narrative that that's all that we're solving for. And in fact, whether it's energy abundance and reliability, affordable and geopolitical security, you can see it in the Davos write-offs. But again, there seems to be a tinge of sadness from those folks who attend regularly. You then look at DeepSeek, which obviously had a dramatic impact yesterday, though the actual version of it's actually been around for a little bit. So it is interesting. We just noticed it over the weekend. There's been a lot of talk that China is the new Japan in terms of demographics and economic malaise and so forth. I would just observe that we now have a second example. We had electric vehicles where China, whatever you think of it, is a dominant producer of low cost and in some cases desirable electric vehicles. And now they at least seem to have some competitiveness on AI. So if we want to, so I think the question is, has the death of China been greatly exaggerated? Now, none of this is a commentary that we're going to go back to the days of 400,000 or 500,000 barrels a day of consistent oil demand growth from China. But I would observe, and when we started figuring out that Japan might have peaked, they were a rich country. And they were a country of only 120 million people or so. China is a country of 1.4 billion people. And whatever you think of them, they've merely attained middle income status. And so I just think that it is worth pausing. This narrative that it's over for China, is that actually true when we look at some of the successes they're having? And I think these are just some of the longer term implications that we worry about. So do I know if the stock market oversold yesterday or not? I have no idea. I would just say this is a signpost that maybe China has some health to it. And then the last point I would simply make on Trump and all the policies that were enacted, whatever you think of him, whatever you think of them, our core macro theme has been super volatility. And I think That is a feature that is going to stay here. We're going to have to see how this stuff shakes out. And if I go back to Davos, there is a recognition that the world is changing. With Trump in power, the world is changing. What does that mean? I think that's what makes carbon energy. Philippe has been doing this for 37 years. I've been doing it for 34. Maynard, you're probably within my ballpark, and so is Mike. It's what makes this sector so much fun. One of my most well-received morning calls at Goldman Sachs, there was some tech company that had passed sort of Chevron and ExxonMobil as sort of the largest market cap. And I made the observation, how many other industries can you go back 100 years to the Standard Oil Company was originally founded just after the Gettysburg Address. And these companies, whether it's ExxonMobil and its predecessors, Chevron, Royal Dutch Shell, they've gone through World War I. They've gone through World War II. They've gone through the Korean War, the Vietnam War. They've gone through inflation and collapse. They've gone through COVID and the great financial crisis. Yet these are still some of the largest, most dominant companies out there. So when you think of a world of uncertainty, where there's a morning in Davos, there's deep sea coming out of nowhere out of China. And when you think about what is Trump and any future president going to do, here's a company, ExxonMobil, and again, Chevron, Shell, all deserve similar credit for having withstood the inevitable twists and turns of geopolitics and macro volatility over 100 years. And when you look at other leaders today, are we sure 100 years from now, Apple is still going to be the dominant technology company? Is that likely? What about Microsoft? What about NVIDIA? Yet here we have living, breathing examples of these oil and gas historically companies adapting to change. And I think we're going to turn to our guests now. It is what gets me excited about the outlook for ExxonMobil specifically. When you see how they have responded to what was a tough decade for them and for all of industry, I think they are collectively, and ExxonMobil specifically, are on track to come out better than ever. But I think with that, Maynard, I'll turn it back to you and to our guest.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Arjun. And again, welcome, Philippe. You know, I think as I mentioned it in the lead-in, we noticed some of your writings and some of the things that you were talking about. You know, as a lead-in, I noticed, I think the number is ExxonMobil employs about 12,000 people across Europe. You've been on the continent for, I think, over 135, close to 140 years. So your history, you just permeate Europe. You are Europe. And so it was really striking to read some of the things you were saying, which were, I think, coming from your heart as a Frenchman, as a European, wanting to see some better policies. Let me stop talking and just, again, thank you for joining us, and maybe ask you to tell us a little bit about what led you to start speaking out, and what is some of the basics of your message.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. And once again, thank you for the opportunity, Maynard. But when you look at Europe, and when I think about Europe, it's the EU, it's the 27 member countries, it's the UK. But to understand Europe and where we are now, we need to understand the political cycle in Europe a little bit. And what I mean by that is the European Parliament, the European Commission are typically, they are on a 5-year cycle, which means we have parliamentary elections and then a selection of the Commission. And we just completed a 5-year cycle, which what we call the President von der Leyen I Commission, which ended in the summer of last year. New elections, new composition of the Parliament, new Commission, but the same President. Ursula von der Leyen is the President of the Commission, and will continue for another 4.5 years. And we are at this pivotal moment where the new Commission needs to announce its strategic agenda, its priorities, what it's going to do differently, more of the same, direction, priorities. It's now. And when I say now, we expect an announcement tomorrow, which they call the compass. We will have the work list in the middle of next month. And more importantly, the big announcement on the clean industrial deal that will take place on February 26th. And that will kind of set the strategic direction for the Commission going forward. And it's therefore for us, it's very important to at least share what we see, what we expect, the issues that are on the table and some of the solutions. And we are pretty clear that we're at a point where Europe has two very important objectives in front of it. One is what you were talking about, the challenges and the decarbonization objective, very ambitious for Europe. The EU has the target of being carbon neutral by 2050, a 55% reduction of emissions by 2030 compared to 1990. Very, very ambitious, aggressive, and probably leading the world in that field. And at the same time, is definitely facing significant economic challenges. Economic growth is very low. Purchasing power of many European citizens has gone down over the past 5 years. And for us, very visible, the competitiveness and attractiveness of Europe for industry and the private sector is just not there. And so when we look at those two challenges, Europe is not going to meet either, but it doesn't have to be that way. And we're trying to participate on the debate about how can Europe get back on track, Europe get back on the objective of meeting its environmental objectives as well as its economic prosperity and attractiveness objective. And I'll be happy to develop a little bit more. But that's why now is kind of a critical moment as we see it, because the next few weeks are going to define what the Commission is going to focus on in the next 5 years.
That's a great lead in. And I don't think, Philippe, I'll speak for us here, at least at Veritain. I don't think we quite had the understanding that now is the time to speak, because now is the time when the planning is happening. So that's great context. Maybe one question. I know Europe is many flavors with many moving pieces, obviously. And I know we got a German election coming. People talk a lot about Germany having back-to-back down years in their economy, which is, really, it's not unprecedented, but it's rare. What do you observe about? You have these problems you're trying to address, but there's just multiple jurisdictions. Do you think that we will see one place or one leader emerge that pushes this whole thing in a certain direction? Or how do you feel about the component pieces? What's the way to influence this most efficiently?
No, it's a very, very good point. And I would say, while I think what we say, what many others say, resonate more with the European policymakers, it's more visible and attracts more attention. I think we as industry, we as investors have been talking about this challenge for at least 3 years, and very clearly starting to be louder and louder 2 years ago, 1 year ago. Now I think it's even more public, but we have raised this issue of competitiveness and attractiveness for some time. There are a couple of events that I think amplified the message of some of us in the private sector. One big one is called the Mario Draghi report, the former prime minister of Italy, which was asked to write a report on the competitiveness of Europe. Another report, which also touched on it, was about the attractiveness of the single market and the functioning of the single market by another Italian prime minister, Mr. Letta. And those two reports were very clear and articulated the fact that Europe was not on track. On one hand, there is good news because there's a lot of opportunities, there is potential, but they also say potential needs to be translated into reality, and there are big gaps. I think in the Draghi report, you hear about the cost challenge, you hear about the productivity improvement, you hear about the innovation challenges, and all these that can be addressed, but would require a very, very significant investment. The number that is quoted in Mr. Draghi's report is 800 billion euros. But it also talks about the different elements that create challenges. We talked about cost, and for us, when we look at it, it's energy and labor. We talk about, say, CO2 cost, as simple as that. That's something Europe has that the rest of the world typically doesn't have. There's also a big element of regulatory burden. And that's something that has increased very significantly over the past 5 years. And this regulatory and policy environment, while it could be supported, happens to be very burdensome and, in fact, hindering investment rather than supporting it. So when you put all this together, there are a lot of things that can be done, a lot of things that could be done now, some of them at no cost. And that's why when you build on some underlying comments from industry and the private sector, but building on very strong messages from independent reviews, which led ultimately all the way to the Commission talking about the strategic importance of restoring competitivity. I think now is the time to move from talking about it to acting on it.
You know, we were talking about this, Philippe, amongst ourselves coming into today, and I think, you know, because we're energy people, we always zero in on energy as such a big variable, and it's a very important variable. The cost of power, cost of oil and gas, the cost of infrastructure, all these things. But it is easy for us to forget that there are other issues. There are labor markets and trade markets and disclosure requirements and regulation and immigration. There's so many other things. When you sit with the people who will listen, what sort of do you have a pecking order for, hey, let's address this and then let's address this? Like, how do you attack? This is not a single problem. This is a handful of things coming together. How do you sort of prioritize, do you think, if you're...
No, that's a very good question. I'll come back to energy because I think it's important, and it also helps understand where Europe is now and why. But when I look at, I think everybody now agrees, political world, private sector, I mean, it's pretty clear that Europe has a competitiveness and attractiveness issue. It needs to work on it. I think the question for us and the recommendations we make are, what can be done now? Now, as in starting next month, not the next long-term program that would deliver in 3 years, but in the meantime, there will have been a lot more casualties on the battlefront in the economy. So the first question is, what can be done now? And for me, it's very clear that the one thing that the Commission can do very quickly at no cost is to start by working on the regulatory burden, postponing the regulations and directives that are not already implemented that will impact competitiveness negatively, fix them, simplify the regulatory framework, and that can only move forward. In fact, there's a what we call the European Roundtable for Industry, a group of CEOs in Europe that regularly dialogue with the Commission. When they were asked last year, what is the number one thing you would like to see? More than 90% said reduction of the regulatory burden. So that's for us the first thing. And concretely, one ask, and that's on the table. In fact, it has even been picked up by the Commission. We have two very burdensome regulations called the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directives and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Very burdensome, requiring companies to disclose a lot of data, but also to do a lot more very challenging due diligence activities. These are good examples of activities that should be paused, that should be reassessed through a competitiveness lens, and then adjusted to meet the intent. I mean, who would debate the fact that it's important to work on human rights, child labor, and the environment? Everybody agrees with that. The problem is doing it in such a way that is very burdensome, questionable, and whether it will help meet the objectives. That's what we're talking about. So that's the first one. For me, that's the big first piece. And what's important is, as you know, Europe doesn't have a lot of money, and especially the EU doesn't have a lot of money. It's important to come with ideas that do not cost money to governments, and that's a good one. The second one, I will come back to that, is going from a very technology-specific and mandate approach to, in particular, the energy transition, to an approach that is technology open and enables the market to function and enables technologies and solutions to compete. And that's, for me, the two concrete asks that could be addressed starting tomorrow. Then there is the question of what can be done in energy, and we'll come back to that.
So you touched on a number of key things. Let me just pick up one thread you mentioned, which is, just capital and the need for money. And when you think about this, of course, there's been a lot of spending around climate initiatives, those objectives. In the wake of what's going on in Ukraine, we all have a changed mentality around national security and security for the West, and we've all changed dramatically in that department. How do you think Europe is going to balance all of these needs? Because you also mentioned investment, things that need to happen outside of all that. Is money a big issue? Because there are a lot of balance sheets with European governments that are stressed. How do you think about just the budget to do these things?
My very short and simple answer is, first of all, government budgets are not the solution. The solution is private sector investment. And in order to get there, Europe needs to be attractive. I mean, that's the very short answer to the question. But I'll come back a little bit because, yes, you said there are different objectives. And that's a very important element. If we try to analyze why Europe is where it is now and what has led us to focus us as Europe, focus so much on the climate and energy transition issue and probably insufficiently on the other challenge like energy price, energy supply security, we need to go back to 2019, which is when the previous commission was elected, when selected, and when the parliament was elected. 2019, energy supply security is taken for granted. We have supply by pipe from Russia. We have other sources of supply. Overall, it looks solid, at least in the mind of the policymakers. The costs are very reasonable. And cost of energy, yes, more than US, but not by a factor of 4. And what was really the focus of attention of the European population was 2 things, the climate and immigration. And this is measured every 6 months by the Eurobarometer, the Commission. So we have data to support that. And so while immigration was an ongoing challenge for Europe, climate was the topic. And it was the topic in the mind of Europeans, but also in the streets. You may remember the climate the demonstrations in Europe in 2019. It was everywhere. And so the European Commission's priority, the Green Deal, was clearly focused on addressing this one issue that was perceived as the most important at that time, climate, energy transition, the Green Deal. That was what it's called. And the Green Deal was also supposed to be a green growth strategy. In practice, the green growth has not happened. The Green Deal has helped decarbonize, but it also showed some of the key challenges. What has been very important, and you said Ukraine, there were 3 crises between 2019 and today. The first crisis was COVID, and Europe was probably more impacted than any other region in the world, not because COVID was tougher, but because of the approach trying to safeguard as much as they could in the economy. So in terms of money spent and debt created, Europe was probably very much impacted, and that's visible today. Then came, right after that, the invasion of Ukraine. And for us Europeans, it's our doorstep. When you go to Poland, when you go to Hungary, Romania, it's across, I mean, it's really close. Some have common borders with Ukraine. So it's a reality every day we think and we see about it. And it's almost every day in our news. And that created, of course, major concerns, security concerns, immigration, additional immigration concerns, economy concerns. And then that was followed by the gas supply issue, which created a major energy supply security challenge. And so when you go to what's on the mind of today's politician and citizens, it's 5 things. It's not just 1 or 2. Security, Ukraine, and to a certain extent, what's happening in the Middle East. The second one is obviously economic growth and economic prosperity and what it means for me, purchasing power. You have industrial competitiveness and investment. You obviously have the climate that is still here. And so it has changed the dynamic because government have to split the limited amount of money they have from one big issue to 4 or 5, all needing the same thing. And therefore, and that was what Draghi was saying, yeah, we need 800 billion a year, but not only that, the majority of that will need to come from the private sector because it's not going to come from government. And therefore, how is Europe going to attract that is the fundamental issue, one that up until now had not been really addressed.
Maybe, Philippe, I think, everybody talks about this amorphous sort of deindustrialization of Europe, and they, generally speaking, understand that factories and heavy industrial activity is going elsewhere, oftentimes to work and find cheaper energy as well as, other things. But could you maybe personalize it a little bit? If you were thinking about opening a new industrial facility, particularly in Western Europe, Can you just give our viewers and listeners a sense of just how challenging that would be? Like I hate to make it so basic, but you got to buy the land and you got to get the permit and then you got to contract and get the additional permits. Like just a sense of the complication of doing business in Europe. I don't mean for you to give a negative commercial for Europe, but at the same time, I think people just need to understand what this bureaucracy really means.
Yeah, and there are several aspects to that. First part of the question, at this time, we don't see how we could do what you just said, which is consider a major investment in Europe, because just Europe cannot compete. Europe doesn't think about the business case for investors. It thinks about what it needs, but you need to match the two. In the absence of a business case, it's really hard to see how investors are going to come. But when you come to Europe, well, first of all, we call it the EU, but it's the EU plus 27 member states, and there are some specificities in every member state. So it's not because you have a regulation on something or a directive or a law on something in France that it will be exactly the same in Poland. We have to be first be very careful with that. It's the EU, but there's still a lot of country specificities. I think the other thing is, especially if you're not already in Europe, from day one, you'll inherit tens of thousands of regulations and laws that you have to meet the expectations from. And we are using very actively this example with the European Commission right now. I was mentioning this corporate sustainability due diligence directive. The day you set foot in the European market and you have a certain size, you have to abide to the requirements of this directive, not only for your European operation, but for your global operations. That is the kind of thinking that is going to really deter Europeans from coming if not only I need to meet the expectation of Europe in Europe, but it's going to impact my global business. And there's some of that is part of the regulatory package that we see. But on top of that, permitting is definitely not simpler than the US. It can be even a lot more complicated. We use that number, and that's something that Draghi put in his report. Over the past 5 years, there's 13,000 new directive, regulations, act, and implementation explanation that have been published by the European Commission. 13,000. That's about 3 to 4 times what happened in the US in the same period of time. And so this over-regulation and the fact that rather than enabling investors, US investors, even European investors to unleash their creativity to help address the challenges that Europe has, what Europe is telling investors is not only what to do, but where to do it, how to do it, by when to do it, and if you don't do it, here's what's going to happen. I mean, that's really not something conducive to attracting investment, and that's exactly what we're seeing, but also what we're telling government. As a company, you may have seen or heard, we have earmarked $30 billion of investment in the emission reduction and low carbon space: hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, low emission fuels, and lithium. And when I go to policymakers in Europe and say, Europe should be the number one customer and the number one destination of that money. You have the most ambitious goals, you have the shortest timeline, and this is exactly the kind of area where Europe wants to invest, wants investors to invest. But right now, literally none of that will go to Europe because there are much better things to do. We can do a lot more with better money and better returns in the United States, in Canada, and there are a lot other parts of the world that are indicating strong interest to attract that investment. Whereas Europe continues to say we need it, but on the other hand, they put regulations and directives that seem to say the opposite. We're not saying we don't need regulations. We do need some, but we need good regulations and just what's necessary, not overlapping regulations that become so complicated, it becomes very difficult to plan your business.
Yeah, Philippe, Maynard and Arjun, they really do a good job at asking sort of secular macro questions. I'm going to ask you more of a cyclical question since I'm the markets guy. And I guess I want to get a feel for, you're president of ExxonMobil Europe. You've been there for 6 or 7 years. So specifically the chemicals and refining industries, every time we talk to investors, right now we're sort of in an overcapacitated situation. Everyone always says, in order to get us in a better situation, Europe's going to have to close more refiners or more chemical facilities. Maybe give us an idea of where you think the European refining industry is right now from a global competitive standpoint. And back to your answers earlier about if we don't get some regulatory relief, if Europe does not get out of sort of this low growth, what does that mean for the next, say, 3, 4, 5 years for those industries?
Yeah, and thanks. That's a really good question. I would say definitely in the back and the front of our mind here in Europe. And I'm going to talk about refining and chemicals separately because first the dynamic has been a little different in the two. But starting with chemical, I think the gas crisis really stepped up the visibility of the European chemicals industry challenges. And especially when you go further east, I mean, the German chemical industry is extremely challenged right now. And we see that in an oversupply market with very thin margins, the least competitive assets or the assets that have the highest cost of production are obviously the one that may shut down. And we have seen already, I think our trade association issued a number which said 11 million tons a year of capacity of chemicals in Europe that has already shut down. This is substantial. This is reflective of a combination of lack of base competitiveness, but also difficulties to reinvest for all the reasons I've mentioned. Where is that heading? Well, you can predict cycles better than I can do, but definitely we're still at the bottom of the cycle and have been there for a while. So you can see that pressure on the chemical industry. The way we, the Industry Trade Association, even our company talk about what's going on in Europe is the chemical industry is in crisis in Europe and in need of urgent action because that rationalization that has started, obviously, if there is no improvement, that's going to be really challenging. I mean, for an industry that pays the highest energy cost, that has to pay a carbon cost, that have high labor costs, still need to change to enable it to compete. The refining industry, I think it's a slightly different because the one difference between refining and chemical demand in Europe continues to be pretty strong. It's not growing as fast as other parts of the world, but there is still a little bit of growth. What is changing is the relative competitiveness, who is oversupplied, and the trade flows. In refining, Europe has already started to see some reduction in demand. When you look at energy demand in Europe, it's going down. Transportation, to a certain extent, we're starting to see some reduction as well of liquid fuels. But it's not as fast as probably Europe would want it to get to the reduction needed. We're clearly seeing how difficult it is to decarbonize sectors like transport or feedstock to chemical. So there has been some rationalization. I was looking at some numbers before this call, and there has been some reduction from about 100 refineries to about 75 over the past 15 years. So you're starting to see rationalization. I think you should, when you look at the assets that are in Europe, you have some big coastal integrated refineries that have definitely sources of competitive advantage and do compete. And then you have smaller, unintegrated, sometimes country-specific refineries for which it's probably going to be more challenging. You see some conversion of some refineries into biorefineries as part of the trend, but I think refining is going through that rationalization. The question really for refining and for liquid fuels is, are liquid fuels, well, first of all, they are essential, so they're not going to go away anytime soon. But are the low carbon version of liquid fuels be fully enabled, or is Europe going to go, as is the case right now, more towards maximum electrification? In which case you should see a decline, but post 2035 would be what my projection would say.
Philippe, I really appreciate yourself and ExxonMobil speaking out about the need for regulatory relief and reform in Europe to attract investment. As an American, we have these long cycles where we have more regulation and less. So we had LBJ, Nixon, Carter, more regulation, and I'm simplifying here, Reagan, HW, and Clinton, less regulation. And you have these elections and it can affect the direction of the country. In Europe, you have a European Union and a European Commission that sits on top of these countries. So I can appreciate an individual like country can have an election where they go from, let's just to be simplified, go from left to right or something in between. I think the European Union and European Commission is relatively newer. We don't have a 100-year history of going through these cycles. As an American, again, I apologize. They seem like the beliefs are more consistent with the World Economic Forum in Davos and the Conference of Parties process and these types of international type organizations. What is the capacity to evolve? I can appreciate ExxonMobil and other business leaders speaking out. It doesn't seem like it's in the DNA, but again, for an American audience, how does that actually flow through to the EU and European Commission to affect the kind of regulatory reforms that do seem critically needed for Europe?
No, that's probably the fundamental question. And just for the audience, about more than 70% of all the laws implemented in the member state start in Brussels. So it starts with the European Union. It doesn't start by itself. It comes from the heads of state who ask the Commission to draft a regulation to do this or that. They set the priority and the objective, and then it's translated into regulation. The real challenge, as you pointed out, is the structure is designed to regulate. And what I mean by that is the role of the European Commission is to write regulations and directives. And so if one thing is sure is you don't deregulate by writing a regulation. That's not going to function. And I think the question is, how is it going to happen? How is it going to change? I think that a couple of elements. There is still a strong political signal that comes from the Parliament and from the Council to the Commission on the expectation and the focus areas. The Commission President is elected by the Parliament, and there has been a change in the composition of the Parliament. That's very visible in the Parliament today versus the Parliament 2 years ago. How is that going to materialize into actual changes in the way the Commission is going to work? We do expect that in a month, on February 26th, there will be a very strong call for simplification, competitiveness assessment, reducing regulatory overlap. I think that is the right objective. How the regulatory machine responds. On one hand, the Commission has some of the best technocrats in the world. I can guarantee you, I work with them, I meet with them. They're fantastic people. But they will have to think about what they do differently, which is, how do I simplify 30 years of work versus build another regulation to meet a new target? And when I think about it from my private sector experience, and I sometimes share that with policymakers, is as companies, we all have to step back every 7, 8, 9 years and say, okay, am I doing things the right way? Am I approaching my challenges with the right method? Business process redesign. And when we do the business process redesign, we are willing to, okay, throw the old method out and bring the new state-of-the-art, supporting a new IT and everything. That's what would be needed. Can it be done? Well, I would say yes, if we change the mindset, but it will be a pretty significant change that we would need to get there. I hope we will, because that's absolutely critical. The one thing that is also clear is that a lot of the methods, when we talked about technology neutrality and the approach, the prioritization was given to certain technologies based on certain assumptions and certain preferences. I definitely do expect the new council and the new parliament to be very clear that they want more technology openness. And that's something you can relatively quickly correct. You don't have to say green, you say clean hydrogen, and you immediately open the door to many other technologies. That could happen quickly.
Actually, I just want to ask a quick follow-up on that last point, which I think is critical. When I use the term technocrats, I find the people one-on-one to be impressive. They are smart people. They have studied stuff. The willingness to believe, maybe this is my American overlay, optimistic assumptions on something like green hydrogen as one example, and that by some relatively short period of time, we can displace a large portion of gas or other fuels with this very specific technology, which is not broadly utilized today. It doesn't mean it can't happen, but the willingness to bet your continent or your country on those types of technocratic assumptions, I just found it stunning over the last several years. And I think you just made the point that, listen, these things can all change. And maybe I'm overreacting to it and given a very sort of an American viewpoint on this, but there did seem to be we're going to do this. And I'm respectful of people who have different environmental objectives and they have different climate objectives than perhaps I do. I actually have no issues with that. But how, as a commission, as a technocrat, could you say we're going to, apologies, bet the farm on this set of technologies when they're clearly unproven, even if they could be proven someday?
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot about the ambition and the vision, which is important, but then the question is the pathway. And, my summary in one sentence of the challenge is that Europe has been trying to do the right thing, but has been doing it the wrong way. And I think it's a question of how to improve that way and get there. Green hydrogen is a very good example of the philosophy behind it was how do we look at and see Europe in 2050? What is perfection in 2050? And then we will only invest in what 2050 should look like. This is not how the real world works. The real world works on where am I today? How am I moving forward in the right direction? And how do I enable that lowest cost pathway to that future I want? And I think that's what's missing in the Commission. But also there is a clear realization that because of that, Europe is going to miss its objectives. I understand here you had Chris Birdsall, my colleague, talk about the global outlook. And Chris and I worked on a Europe version of the global outlook to look at what does the forecast look like. Well, we see Europe reducing emissions by 50% and not 55% by 2030. Why is that? Because 10 million tons of green hydrogen by 2030 is not possible. And by the way, the cost would be completely phenomenal. And you have many of those other examples where by not taking into account the different options that exist, understanding the relative cost and what the lowest cost pathway to society looks like, there was some kinds of bet or expectation or assumptions made. But now we're back to realism. And that's the piece that can change also in the policy making world is more pragmatism, more realism. I think there's this question of we should not let a policy go forward without a competitiveness assessment. Nobody can use green hydrogen today because it's far too expensive. If you do a little competitive assessment, you pick that immediately. But no, there was probably less of this impact assessment and competitive assessment than would have been necessary, and therefore too much of that wishful thinking versus pragmatic go forward. And that's why what we're saying is we don't know what the answer is, but let the different technologies compete and let the market help find the way to the lowest cost pathway to what we need.
Maybe, Philippe, if I could latch on to that last comment you just made, which is let the market decide. Now, I don't want to, I'll try to wade into sort of a cultural observation, but the market and letting the market decide. If you go back to 2019, when the priorities were laid out that you were talking about, that period versus today, it seems like in the Western world we're remembering a little bit about markets and free enterprise and saluting people who take those risks and take on those challenges. Is there something that needs to happen at a more sort of ground level where the voters sort of re-embrace markets, remember markets, and push their representatives to also think in that way and to implement policies in that way? Is there sort of a broader question here around the power of and usefulness of free markets that needs to be emphasized?
I think that's a really good question. And, I've lived on both sides of the ocean. The concept of the importance of market and how powerful markets are is very ingrained in the US mindset. I mean, I think this is definitely part of the thinking. Here, there's always this, yes, we need markets, but we need to control markets. We need markets, but we need to guide markets. We need markets, but we need to ensure that we're getting the results we want. So I think here it's always trying to find the right balance. And that's why I was saying we need markets, but we'll continue to see regulations. When you think about emission reductions, for example, Europe has had the emissions trading scheme, so-called the ETS, which is a price of carbon and a market mechanism to enable participants to buy the carbon allowances that they needed. In practice, when it functioned pretty well as a mechanism. So it's a combination of an enforcement mechanism by creating the ETS, but a market to enable the different players to to work on their own decarbonizations and those who could accelerate, sell, or buy less allowances. It worked well, but it also now is hitting its limitation, which is that if Europe is the only region that has a carbon market and all its producers, domestic producers, need to pay a carbon price, products that come from the outside do not, and you end up at a substantial competitive disadvantage, especially if you're energy intensive. And so that's a good example where I think there's some trust in market. Sometimes there is some trust, but then there is 3 other regulations on top of it to make sure we get to the final result. Then you distort the market, it's not as effective. So I would say there is a need for more, and it's not necessarily in the European DNA to rely as much on markets as has proven successful in the United States, for example.
I was thinking about the 2019 marker. So you got to Europe, to Mike's point, in 2018, 2019, these objectives were put in place, and then the world changed, as you said, so dramatically. I mean, the other thing that changed, just taking a quick look, Exxon, the stock has more than doubled in that period. We've all remembered, the investment community has remembered all the good things about the company, and the company has performed well. And the other thing that's changed that's very interesting is, culturally, Exxon, I would say, is just more out in public talking about these issues. You're doing it, others are doing it. Chris put out his, the long-term forecast. What would you say about the issue around getting more involved in these debates as a business, as a businessman, and you do take risks doing that? What's the debate around doing that? Has it been comfortable, hard? Are you glad you did it? Like, that's just a really interesting development. I think it's one we all benefit from, but I'm just curious, your own personal journey doing that, how has that been?
Well, first, super exciting, because when the intent is to speak the truth and help people understand what's really happening, I mean, it matches your values very well. I personally feel extremely comfortable sharing what I've learned, what I see, and what could be done with policymakers, because when I do it with first in mind, what's the right thing for society? If we can find the right pathway for society, ExxonMobil will find its way. We have technology, we have technologists, we'll find a way to participate. And that's how we have adjusted over the past 135 years. So I think from a personal belief standpoint, it's something that is relatively easy to do. It can be very difficult because not always well perceived, well accepted. But when we bring concrete examples, when we bring facts, being grounded on the fundamentals, really help bring the debate back to who wants to buy hydrogen at 13 euros a kilo? Well, virtually no one. And that explains why it's not developing. And when you start talking to the policymakers in those terms, and 13 is a public domain number that the Netherlands country put out as part of a study they did, you start to get more of a debate of, okay, what could be done to lower the cost? And we can start talking about what solutions can we bring. Blue hydrogen can be deployed faster, would be more affordable. Why not blue hydrogen? And so what's important for me, and when I approach this job, and I think ExxonMobil as a whole, we do all the same thing. We are here to help bring those solutions. We look at ourselves as a technology company. We look at what society needs and how we can help. We don't control everything, obviously, but we focus our technology on those things, and we try to help. And we fully understand the importance of policy. And that's why, especially in the energy transition world, it's very clear to us that what we need is we need technology, we need markets, and we need policies. Without policies, it's not going to happen. And therefore, the need to participate in that debate.
And this is sort of counter to this philosophy of we shouldn't talk about flavors or pick flavors, or we should let the market decide. But watching the flavors, one of the things we find interesting is attitudes around natural gas in particular. And is natural gas on the winning team or on the losing team as people think about energy policy? We would be strong advocates that it is absolutely on the winning team for decades and decades. That one and nuclear. And I'm just curious what you would tell us about attitudes in Europe around those flavors? Because we would like to see governments have unbiased approaches, but I suppose that comes with the request that they also include the things they should be including on the menu, and maybe stop hand-wringing over certain flavors. What would you tell us about those two flavors, or just anything else you'd add on sentiment towards various energy approaches?
No, well, first of all, and this is a very typical example of the EU is not really the EU. Mm-hmm. The energy mix decisions are member state specific. The EU can classify a fuel or a solution as renewable, not renewable, compliant with net zero 2050 or not, whatever they want to say. But ultimately, every country will decide its own energy mix. I think natural gas is a very interesting example, because when the debate started back to 2019, it was clearly a solar and wind are the solutions. We don't need the rest. And therefore, gas not needed. As people started to look more closely and understand better why gas is necessary and why gas will be necessary for decades, gas became part of gas is needed for the transition. But I think the perception of gas has changed. I think the Ukraine invasion and then the crisis on the gas supply for Europe also helped people realize we need it every day. It's essential. We need to secure that supply. And it's not going away anytime soon. I would say it's also true for liquid fuels and oil. The very same rational functions. So it is changing. I think when we started, the response to the Ukraine invasion was, let's see all the infrastructure we can get, because Europe didn't have the infrastructure initially to bring enough gas. Fortunately, a lot of FSRUs heading towards Europe. They were hooked to the system in no time, and we passed the first winter. We passed the second winter. We're at the end of the third one. I think we'll be okay. But it was a change towards, oh wow, we need the supply and we need the infrastructure, and that's clearly my message to policymakers here in Europe: is why are we where we are? Where we are is that energy systems need three things: energy supply, security, cost, and environment. If you focus exclusively on the environment and forget the rest, it will bite you back. And that's exactly what happened. And that's why there's more of a balanced approach right now. There is still a reluctance to long-term contract because some people believe that they may not need gas for as long as that. It's very clear in our mind that gas is needed post-2050 in Europe, even if when Europe wants to be carbon neutral in 2050. And I think we'll continue to have that debate. On one thing that was very interesting, the gas market worked. In fact, the gas market worked very well. It had a huge impact on Europe because Europe ended up having to pay a huge price for gas. But by doing that, Europe attracted gas that it didn't have under long-term contract and could survive that first winter. And we keep reminding policymakers that it could have been different if there had been different contracts in place, but the gas market worked. And that's a good example of a functioning market. Nuclear is a different story. And I'm French, born in the 60s, went through the boom of the nuclear energy in France. I know nuclear. I understand what it brings, why it's important. Go to Germany, 30 years of, I think, of education that nuclear is dangerous, is a bad thing, should not be considered. And therefore, you have almost the two opposites here. You have France investing in new reactors, and you have Germany shutting down theirs and saying we probably don't need them any longer. This is the typical country-specific choices based on preferences, culture, 30 years of evolution of the thinking. But it's clear, as you know, as a company, we see nuclear for what it is, which is it is a low-carbon solution. It brings an additional supply option to many countries. You can see the Central European countries are very interested and are building or going to build nuclear reactors. But you will definitely not see a consistent approach in Europe because of this philosophical differences on what nuclear is and whether they would want to have it in their mix. That doesn't mean that, for example, Germany is not going to import French power. They could still get nuclear power indirectly, but building reactors more complicated. But we'll see. I think this is also an industry that will be very interesting to follow, not only with the traditional reactors, but the smaller ones.
Yeah, Philippe, I think about you mentioned gas a little while ago, and back during the Ukrainian war, Europe was lucky because they were able to get a lot of cargoes from Asia, LNG cargoes. Last couple of years, it's been a very warm winter. They've been able to refuel their inventories, but we're entering this winter lower. We're going to exit much lower. And so it looks like gas prices are going to be pretty high in Europe relative to the rest of the world. I guess my question is, and the other thing you just mentioned, French nuclear power capacity has come up quite significantly over the last 2 or 3 years. So that's been very beneficial. So all those things have been working in Europe's favor. We've got a colder winter. It's going to be higher prices. A lot of things are maxed out. How do you see things playing out heading into next winter? And how do you think things play out if the EU Commission does not start to basically embrace these regulatory issues? Because it seems like the cyclical aspects have worked in your favor, but they could start to work against them in the next 12 to 18 months.
I think you're making a very important one. When we look back in 2022, 2023, mild winter, not much economic growth in Asia, therefore need for gas was not as high as it could have been. That enabled Europe to go through. I think what has changed in Europe is the recognition that we need gas, a lot of attention on inventory levels, expectation from member states that they will fill their inventory level before we get into the winter season. More infrastructure being built. I mean, in addition to the FSRUs, you start to see some permanent facilities being built in Germany and in other countries. So I think there is on the infrastructure the understanding that we need more, and that's happening. I think there is also this commitment to long-term contract, which will ensure availability, where progress is being made, but it's slower. And I think you probably saw that US is now the #1 supplier of LNG to Europe. Very important, that really enabled Europe to go through. I think Europe is also looking at how to limit Russian gas imports going forward beyond pipeline gas, especially looking at LNG. And that could create both new opportunities and new challenges, as it may limit the options for Europe. But I think it's definitely on the radar screen. It's getting a lot of attention. The real challenge, as you said it, is Europe TTF is at $14 per million BTU, where US is between 3 and 4. And that has been the case for quite some time.
Philippe, we've spent a lot of the time here talking about the outlook for European regulations, where they are, how they might change, and so forth. There's been an aspect, I think it's driven from the climate environmental standpoint to, in some cases, try and impose those regulations on the rest of the world. I think about the carbon border adjustment, and we've seen some notion of pushback. I apologize, I don't remember if it's the Qatari energy minister or someone involved in their LNG business saying, well, if they want our LNG, we're going to sell it on our terms. I'm without getting into that specific discussion, more broadly, how do you think about the sort of desire to impose climate regulations on the rest of the world? How does that shake out? Do we meet in some happy middle? I think it's easy for non-Europeans to say, well, we're just going to walk away from Europe, but Europe is still a very large market. They're a very important consumer of natural gas. That's not changing anytime soon. This notion of sort of extraterritorial, let's just call it carbon regulations, if I want to limit it to that. I'm curious how you see the evolution of that going forward.
No, it's a very, very good question, very important to us. I mentioned this corporate sustainability due diligence directive, which is a good example of if you have a big presence here, or if you set foot here without a big presence in the past, you end up being in scope, not only for your European activities. And the fact that Europe rules how the business should be done in Europe, fine, that's perfectly normal. But that because of that, you have to change the way you do your business outside of Europe. And the example I used for us is, why should Europe tell me how to run my gas business in Australia for Australia? That makes no sense. And I don't think that was the intent. And I think that's definitely part of the debate that we expect included. CSDDD, one of the key asks is, remove this extraterritoriality because it's not going to help the climate, and it's not going or human rights or anything, and it's not going to help Europe. So there are some things that will end up being counterproductive, and it's important to identify them. In general, when you think about the approach Europe has taken for the past 5, even 10 years, if the rest of the world follows, Europe is in a good place. If the rest of the world doesn't, Europe is in a very bad place. And the world is not following Europe in terms of regulatory framework and approach. And that's why I think it's very important for us to be back to the real world, which is there are better ways to achieve the same objective. Europe is on that the wrong way to do the right thing, and it needs to get into the right way to do the right thing. I mean, there's a lot of examples. US is a very good one. And I can tell you when the IRA was proposed, and sorry, I'm putting the IRA on the table, but I have to. When the IRA was proposed, and when you look at the IRA, it was intended to set a direction, set objective, and let technologies and the private sector compete for some of these opportunities. Europe was shocked. Europe immediately said, it's not WTO compliant. Oh, it's unfair. It's a subsidy race. And then private sector came in and said, well, you don't understand. That's creating the business case where the US wants to invest. That's what you should be doing. Not complaining, but look at how to help private sector invest. And I think that also contributed to, there are different ways to do things. There are different ways to regulate. And Europe will hopefully learn from the past 5 years and make it more pragmatic, more technology neutral, more market-based, so that people like us and many international companies can see the investment opportunities that we don't see right now.
Philippe, this has been fantastic, just as interesting and informative as we knew it would be. Can I, as we wrap up here, I'll just, one thing we often talk about at Veriton is, what does the energy world look like in 10 years? And all the mix of technology and policy and growth and capital and regulation, all the things that are going to impact that. Maybe just to put a finer point on it, as if you think about Europe, let's say it doesn't change and it stays on this path, and we think about what Europe might look like a decade out if it really stuck to its current policies, if you will, versus a path where it does those things you just said, more practicality, more pragmatism, more neutrality on flavors, more market-based. When you think of those two outcomes in 10 years and how different they might be, I was thinking if you responded to those scenarios, because those aren't narrowly different. Those are seemingly wildly different, but maybe just to have you comment on that might be a great place to end.
No, that's a fantastic question. And for me, if Europe stays on the current path, the implication is that Europe may decarbonize, but will be decarbonized through deindustrialization. It's this pathway where everybody loses jobs, economic activity, supply security. That's the pathway we're on. And we're already seeing it. We're talking about chemical industry, for example. And by the way, that doesn't mean that Europe would meet its objective. It would still probably fail on certain of these objectives. And I don't think anybody would be really happy if we go that way. I think if we correct, it will take time. For me, 2025, 2035 is one unit of time in my world. And we'll start to see carbon capture and storage projects in Europe. We'll start to see a beginning of a hydrogen economy. It will just be the beginning, but hopefully with different sorts of sources of hydrogen. We'll see the continuation of some electrification in transport, light duty vehicle in particular, that has started. Probably not no ICE cars in 2035, but the continuation of a trend. And so we will start to see the deployment, including deployment at scale of some of these very important technologies moving forward, setting the path for the critical decades, 2035 plus. What we're talking here is really the start of the implementation of some of these important decarbonization technology, plus the continuation of the investments in renewable. This will continue. but we'll start to see the low-cost pathway towards net zero materialize with the broad deployment of all the solutions. And that's the one I'm excited about. That's the one I think Europe should look for, especially if Europe wants to lead the world and show the way. That would be the right approach. And hopefully more investment and not no deindustrialization or less deindustrialization. That would be a big winner for me.
Well, that's great. That's a great place to end. Thank you so much for jumping in this debate, for spending time with us, for joining us on the podcast here. We really appreciate it, Philippe. Look forward to getting together with you in person whenever we can do that.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. It was a great pleasure, and thank you to the Veriton team.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.